2. Razin and Thomas were waiting for Dietmar at the top of the Roman Cardo, haggling with fruit vendors beneath the old pillars. Razin glanced up at his approach and motioned towards Thomas, who was still deep in negotiations with a short, grey-haired man behind the stall. "I have yet to see a man more reluctant to part with his coin than your priest." Dietmar offered a thin smile. If Thomas had ever truly been a priest, he would have been defrocked long ago. "I've seen him search for change in the collection box at St. John's. Still, rather a miser than a spendthrift, no?" Thomas pointed to a basket filled with strange, pinkish bulbs and snapped his fingers. "What are these over here? They look like swollen radishes." The vendor sighed into the cloth of his hood and lifted a tray of thinly sliced wedges from behind the stand. By his pained expression, it was clear he'd been entertaining Thomas for some time now. "These are Carthaginian apples from Ifriqiya," the vendor explained, offering the tray forward. "They were brought here at great cost to me and are considered a delicacy even in Madia." "The devil's fruit, no doubt," said Thomas, biting into one anyway. Red juice ran from his mouth as he chewed, staining his lips bright pink. "And you, signor?" inquired the vendor, noticing Dietmar as he offered the tray. Dietmar waved it away, opting instead to choose the 3 ripest-looking apples from their basket. He handed one to Razin, another to Thomas, and tossed the vendor a coin before Thomas could object. "For your time," he said, with a wink to the merchant. The vendor plucked the silver out of the air, disappearing it down the sleeve of his robes. He gave Thomas a triumphant grin and nodded his thanks to Dietmar, who was already turning away from the stall. "Getting fleeced by the merchants of Cardo," Thomas grumbled, hastening to catch up with Dietmar and Razin. "No wonder your estate floundered. They say only a poor man knows what to do with a rich man's money. I could have gotten twice as much for half what you paid, Yesha. And one day, when the street rats at the bottom of David Street decide to stick a knife between your ribs, Yesha will only pause long enough to step over your body and maybe check your pockets." Dietmar tossed his apple in the air and deftly caught it again. "Besides, my accounts are in good order, or they will be soon enough." "Not with edelmen hovering over them," said Razin. "Your bookkeep has never seen a dinar he couldn't skim off the top." "He was my father's man," said Dietmar. "He probably stole from him too." Thomas took a bite from his apple. "So what did the weasel want?" "Is it not enough for an old friend to want to say his goodbyes?" Thomas scoffed, spitting out bits of fleshy pulp and wiping his mouth. "His goodbyes? That little shit would trade away the last shards of the true cross if there was something in it for him." Razin nodded, stepping aside as a merchant and his 2-wheeled cart rumbled past. His gaze followed the vendor's progress down the cobbled road until the cart disappeared into one of the covered markets ahead. "Men like us don't last long in the games Gelmiro plays, and when we die bad deaths." "Important men die all the time in the East," added Thomas sagely. The words had become an unofficial mantra among those who called Jerusalem home. If it wasn't by treachery and murder, then it was in battle, or worse, a slip in the ancient corridors of the city or a fall from the steps to a miserable death, unremarkable but for its banality. And sometimes, like the knights that morning, it was the king's justice and a rope. "I will take a mediocre death," Dietmar thought to himself. Interesting deaths were for the young and brave, for those with eyes blazing with ambition and the conviction that typifies all youth. An invincibility that only begins to wane when those twilight years appear on the horizon. But more than that, interesting deaths were never quick, Dietmar found, and seldom painless. He would rather not linger when his time came. Stretching his legs, he glanced at Thomas. "Then we're lucky we are not important men." Thomas snorted, but held his tongue, chewing on his fruit instead. They left the Cardo behind, stepping onto St. Stephen's Street and following it towards the Patriarch's Quarter. When they reached the top of the Street of Herbs, the lively cries of vendors blended with the sounds of craftsmen in their workshops, the groan of cramp iron being bent around stone, fine chisels chipping away at marble and limestone to create trinkets and keepsakes for the pilgrims who flooded the city, precious rocks polished smooth and scraped down until they shone. Short, bearded Syrians rubbed shoulders with dark-haired Greeks and pale-eyed Latins. The air hummed with 100 voices, a desultory murmur of a dozen languages, all beneath the vaulted ceilings of the covered market. They manoeuvred through the uneven grots, where shadows and piles of accumulated filth threatened to spill onto the road from holes leading to the depths of the city. A second Jerusalem, Dietmar thought as they picked their way through the crowded street. He had ventured into the sewers once as a favour to Gelmiro when he first entered the secretary's employ. He'd been tasked with tracking down a debtor, some down-on-his-luck lump, who had opted to flee rather than repaying his debts. Dietmar had expected the filth and detritus, perhaps some vagrants eking out a living in the small places of the world, scavengers who shied away from the light of his torch when he came close. When he thought there was no end to the winding tunnels, they'd opened up into a cavernous chamber beneath one of the city's ancient pools. There he had seen something he hadn't expected. A thriving subterranean metropolis, complete with a bazaar to rival those of Malquisinat and the market streets above. He had stood there, gulping at the lip of the tunnel until a merchant caught sight of him and hobbled over, unveiling his offerings with a flourish. Dietmar had recoiled when he saw the vendor's wares. Fingers strung together on a string, dangled like a macabre fishing line. When he eventually emerged from the tunnels, Gelmiro was waiting for him, a wide grin adorning his face. Dietmar had sworn at him, called him a bastard, and threatened to beat the shit-eating grin off his face. But Gelmiro had simply tossed another coin purse at him before he could make good on his promises. A meat market, he'd thought. Some cannibalistic enterprise that had somehow survived in the holiest of cities. But it was not, as Gelmiro explained. It turned out that Dietmar had stumbled upon a relic market, one of the oldest in the city, beneath the city, away from prying eyes. Such places offered a range of sacred limbs and bones to those unbothered by matters of certification or origin. Dietmar eyed one of the shadowed corridors and caught sight of a figure moving inside, beckoning him with an outstretched hand. Not today, bonemonger, Dietmar thought, looking away. Broad arched entrances opened up ahead of him, revealing the openings to each shop, divided by a series of transverse arcades. The stalls were narrow but deep enough to accommodate the workshops where the craftsmen created their wares. Above the shops, wooden galleries were supported by stone corbels, serving as sleeping quarters for the craftsmen and shopkeepers. Each doorway bore the marks of ownership, the inverted T of the Templars and the SCA Anna of the Abbey of St. Anna, who vied for rent from the shops. Fishmongers, forced to the stalls nearest to the entrance, barked out prices, dragging Dietmar's eyes to their catch with enthusiastic waves. Gilt-headed sea bream, catfish and carp lay on wooded boards, their scales glistening in the streams of light pouring through holes in the ceiling. They already looked a day past their selling date, and his nose twitched at the smell. A man noticed Dietmar's gaze and called him over, his hands stained with fish guts as he wiped them on his apron. Dietmar shook his head and continued walking deeper into the market, away from the fishmongers and their stink. As they moved away from the scent of sea and iron, Thomas engaged in haggling over a piece of ginger with a spice vendor, while Dietmar and Razin watched the guards playing dice in front of a nearby shop. "You'd take my whole hand for this spindly stick of ginger?" Thomas made a chopping motion for the unimpressed vendor. He dropped the stick of ginger and crossed his arms, waiting for the shopkeeper to lower his price. And so it went. Thomas was right, said Dietmar, watching as a dark-skinned guard bearing the Templar's cross on his breast gathered up all the coins, laughed at his cursing opponents, and pocketed his spoils. Razin raised a brow, his thin face expressing nothing more than his usual suspicion. "Gelmiro wanted something, even now that you are set to leave?" "Aye, it's because I'm leaving that he wants me." Razin blinked at that. Why? Dietmar shrugged. Easier for him to wash his hands of me once it's done. Less chance of it coming back to bite him in the arse. Thomas rejoined them proudly, holding up the stick of ginger. His smile faded when he saw the looks on Dietmar and Razin's faces. Somewhere nearby, a dog began to bark. "Who died?" Thomas asked, taking another bite from his apple, and then tossing the remains on the floor for the rats to fight over. Razin scratched his neatly shaped beard and glanced meaningfully at Dietmar. May as well, Dietmar thought, bracing to announce the change of plans. Thomas was like a grumpy old mule when he didn't get his way, and the news was bound to set him off. "We'll be making a small detour on our way to Zwingenberg," he began slowly, carefully watching Thomas's face to measure his response. "We need to visit the basilica in Naples, where we are to deliver a relic on behalf of the church." "That doesn't sound so bad," said Thomas. The barest flicker of a smile appeared behind his red beard. "They make good wine in Campania, and their women are friendly. We can spend a day there after we dock." Dietmar looked uncomfortable. Then he told them the rest. "Bastard," said Thomas, shaking his head when he had finished. Dietmar winced. "Who, me or Gelmiro?" He looked to Razin for support, but it was not forthcoming. "The both of you," Thomas snarled. "What's to become of our gentle stroll to Jaffa, our leisurely voyage across the Mediterranean? There'll be no sipping wine and feasting on honeyed figs basking in the sun. Not if Amalric sends his butchers after us." Dietmar grunted. "And another thing," Dietmar continued, raising his hands to placate Thomas before he could protest. "We won't be taking a ship from Jaffa. In fact, we won't be travelling from any of Jerusalem's ports at all." Thomas's brow furrowed in fury. "Then how do you propose we leave?" This will do it, Dietmar thought. He took a deep breath, trying to choose his words carefully. "Instead, we will take the Pilgrim's Road to Antioch. Gelmiro has arranged for us to receive assistance from his contacts there, who will help us travel to Messina and then Salerno." "Antioch?" Thomas almost howled. "But that will take weeks. We'll be broiling in the sun, our feet turned to blisters and our tongues like sand in our mouths." Dietmar held up a hand, trying to calm his friend. "The king's dogs would sniff us out in Jaffa or Acre. Better we take a path less travelled, a route that is not so closely watched. A mule will spare your feet, and we'll have ample water to muddy your tongue." Razin drew a small knife from his belt and started peeling his apple. "Less common or no, they will catch us in the sands if word reaches their ears before we reach Antioch. How do you plan on keeping ahead of them if they catch wind of our departure?" "We will have time," said Dietmar. He inhaled a breath of cinnamon and cloves, rosemary and saffron, and faintly beneath the grey rot of the old city. "Amalric intends to convene the Haute Cour to decide on the matter of Salah al-Din and his raids from Egypt. According to Gelmiro, it is already a foregone conclusion. Jerusalem must show her strength or suffer for her weakness later." Razin licked a piece of fruit from his blade, pondering Dietmar's words. "They plan to ride against Saladin?" "Aye," Dietmar confirmed. "They've been spoiling for a fight ever since he tried to take Montreal. When the fight comes, it would be better if we were not in it." Dietmar grunted. He had heard of this vizier-turned-conqueror and the vast armies at his disposal. They said he was a learned man, zealous, that he was a greater strategist than even Nur ad-Din, who had united all of Syria. Such men brought dangerous times with them. I have done my Christian duty and more. He would not have a scimitar sheathed in his belly, not when he was so close to fulfilling his goals, not when he had a chance to reclaim his boy. "We'll make our excuses and depart shortly after the forces mustered by the Haute Cour. With any luck, we'll be in Antioch before they return." "A fine plan," said Thomas, with only a little humour. "Now, let's hope that weasel Gelmiro can keep his mouth shut long enough for us to leave the city, eh?" "He'll feel my hands around his neck if he doesn't," Dietmar replied, forcing a smile. Trusting in one hope was risky enough, but now 2. It seemed like they were pushing their luck. They moved deeper into the market, where the scent of candle wax and the sound of wood carvers filled the air. A man selling bundles of firewood hissed out prices, his robes soaked with sweat. 10 bezants for the conqueror's wood, wood from Nablus, 10 bezants. There are no more forests in Nablus, Thomas called as they walked past. The wood merchant patted his brow with a cloth, leaning over his table and gesturing towards Thomas. Come, take a look. The last wood from Nablus, cedar from Mount Lebanus. His face was as thin and angular as the carp on the tables behind them. His thick lips parted in an unfriendly smile. Pine from Hebron. For 20 bezants, I'll even offer you kindling from the very last beam of wood used in the siege of Jerusalem. Thomas cackled, dismissing the vendor with a wave of his hand. Next they came upon a stall selling candles. The seller, with hands scarred by his craft, watched them from behind his workbench. The scent of animal musk emanated from the shop in the back. Candles crowded the table, the tapered wicks long and limp, hanging over the sides like fishing lines still to be cut. Tall ceremonial candles stood alongside, cheaper-looking wax squares. Some were roughly carved into shapes, vaguely resembling the holy sites scattered throughout the city. There, the Temple on the Mount, David's Tower, and perhaps the Virgin Mother, or possibly an ass. Dietmar pointed to a thick column of tallow with the 5-folded cross carved across its width. How much? The merchant appraised Dietmar, calculating how much he could extract from the franc before replying, 1 bezant. Dietmar handed the seller his coin and picked up the candle. He would light it in the Lord's temple before they departed the city, leaving it with his prayers at the top of the Temple Mount. He perused a crate of musty scrolls claiming provenance in the time of Heraclius. Then he examined the wood of a carver who swore the wood he used came from the very cart Paul rode into Jerusalem, and if not the cart, then from the same tree at least. Please, signor, it's true. Dietmar had it in mind to buy something to take home, a keepsake of his time in the Holy Land to go with all the scars. But nothing in the Street of Herbs caught his eye. He briefly contemplated visiting the Ruga Palmariorium for a palm branch, when a voice cried out from one of the stalls, Chevalier, mon ami! A pot-bellied Frenchman with round eyes and hairy ears stared at him from across the lane. Dietmar's gaze shifted to the vendor's table, noticing an array of fresh fruit, apples, lemons, plums, and jars of figs. Non, merci, he said with an apologetic smile. No sooner had he looked away than he felt a firm tug at his sleeve. The little Frenchman stood beside him, staring up at him. I'm not here for the fruit, Dietmar stated firmly, the apple feeling like a hot coal in his hand. Fruit would only turn to ash in your mouth, chevalier. What? Cheeky bastard. He tried pushing past the merchant, but the little man only smiled and stepped in his way. Have you not seen the vapours rising from Satan's furnace? The Frenchman blinked at him with grey eyes gone red at the edges. Cinders, cinders. That is all you will find if you feast from the fruit on its shores. Then don't sell me fruit from its shores. Get out of my way. The merchant remained unmoved. Soon all fruit will come from its shores, which will cover the world. You're mad. The barking dog let out a strangled yip and fell silent. What's he saying? Thomas appeared at Dietmar's side, joining in the curious gaze of the onlookers. Something about the Dead Sea, Dietmar murmured. The Sea of Devils, the madman exclaimed, pointing a knobbly finger at Thomas. It is the mouth of hell. The birds won't fly over it any longer. Haven't you seen? They know the truth. I have seen it. A voice called out from the crowd, belonging to a long-haired Georgian with yellow teeth. The man beside him shook his head, another Georgian. They started arguing. The mad Frenchman took this as his cue, addressing the gathering crowd instead of Dietmar. Old treacherous, the blind serpent lurks beneath its waters, belching black plumes of smoke, as if he were the devil's chimney. The merchant waved his hands in the air, imitating the path of a serpent through the sea. Soon he will come ashore to wrap his coils around our city. Then we will all be damned. Thomas and a few others laughed, but the atmosphere grew sombre as more people fell silent. And who can deny the foul stench seeping into our homes each night? Rotten fumes from these putrid waters, The merchant turned back to Dietmar, his hooked nose like a beak on his face. "Can you smell it, Chevalier?" "Aye," Dietmar admitted before he could stop himself. There was no denying it anyway, and he'd rather be called a fool than a liar. "You see," the vendor bellowed, raising his hands in triumph, "it is the smell of flesh cooked in the fires of hell. No natural odour. Because it is against nature, the laws do not apply. If you dab my words, throw iron upon its waters, it will float, as if to confound God himself." "And a feather?" asked Thomas with only a half-hearted chuckle. "What happens to a feather?" "It sinks." "What?" "It sinks to the bottom." "Don't be a fool, man." "The Englishman doubts me. It is because the crown of England rests upon a Norman head." The little merchant gave Thomas a mock bow, waving his hands in a sarcastic flourish, and then lowered an imaginary crown upon his oily brown head. The guards, tired of their games, had taken a keen interest in the unfolding event. After a few quiet words, the Turcopole and his comrades rose from their seats and began making their way toward the Frenchman. Time to leave. Dietmar had endured run-ins with the Templars and their enforcers before, and he had hoped to avoid them altogether before returning home. Undeterred, the would-be oracle continued his speech, now raising his voice like a priest in a sermon. "Only the faithful shall be spared," he cried. "They will pass through the poisoned waters of Satan's sea like the river Jordan, unscathed and unblemished by its putridity. Only those damned, those sons of Moabites and bastards of Ammon, shall fall to the serpent's coils." The little man spun on his feet, turning to stare Dietmar straight in the eye. "Chevalier, do you believe?" Dietmar frowned, feeling the gaze of the crowd upon him. A pair of Hospitallers had appeared at the bottom of the street and were in an intense conversation with the guards. The Frenchman grinned. "Oh, but it is not enough to believe." "We should go," said a voice behind his ear. "Razin." "Yes," the Frenchman hissed, his voice like the cooking pans of Malcuisinat, the spit from his mouth like oil. "Run now, Chevalier, while you can, but know that Satan's tide will rise like the waters of Gustrom and drown you wherever you are." Dietmar paused. Gustrom was near his home. "What do you know of me, Blaireau?" His discomfort turned into anger. "How does this little mad bastard know of Gustrom?" He looked up, past the merchant, searching the throng for familiar faces, eyes that would give away the trick, the joke he had been made the butt of. Gustrom was where his mother had died. The merchant laughed, carrying on his tirade, now speaking in French. "Si je n'eus pas par influence céleste, je sauverai l'enfer." Then, in German, "In des Teufels Küche kommen." His eyes widened, as if seeing Dietmar for the first time. He shook his head, like a mother disappointed by a child that wouldn't learn. It looked like he might cry. "Where are you going, Chevalier?" The guards began to push their way through the crowd, urged on by the two Hospitallers behind them. The dog had started to bark again. "Leave him," said Razin, shouldering Dietmar forward as the crowd dispersed. Nobody wanted to be on the other end of Hospitallers' baton, or worse, their questions. Dietmar fixed his eyes on the little merchant, whose scoffing face had transformed into bewilderment and confusion. He clung to the nearest passer-by, speaking rapidly in French, only to be shoved away. He tried the next person, and the next, but nobody wanted to be near him. Dietmar watched him until he disappeared amidst the crowd, like a tusk of stone swallowed by the sea. When Dietmar blinked again, he found himself standing outside the Street of Herbs, breathing in fresh air and gazing into the sun. Razin gently nudged him forward, steering him away from the stream of people pouring out of the covered market. "That crazy little bastard," said Thomas, shaking his head as they crossed Temple Street. Dietmar nodded silently, his thoughts fixed on the Frenchman's final words. Quo vadis? He looked up and saw they were passing beneath Iscariot's arch, from where Judas was said to have hanged himself. He looked away. Has enough death for one day, he thought, trailing behind Thomas and Razin. When Dietmar took a bite from his apple, it didn't turn to ash or cinders in his mouth as the Frenchman had predicted. It was rotten.